Warning, this review video you are about to watch contains themes and depictions of violence, animal abuse, serial killers, and gore that some people may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Horror has a funny way of bringing people together, doesn't it? Most people wouldn't watch horror any other time of the year, but October rolls around and we can't get enough of it. Whether it's the gore, the monsters, the gruesome acts, or even the laughs, horror really likes to bring us together, to laugh at usually fictional villains doing impossible tasks. But sometimes, we find those pretty disturbing tales that bring us together in another reason than just to laugh or enjoy ourselves. Not the exploitative works that make you sick, thank you Human Centipede and the Sacrament, but I mean the stories that could almost be true. The horror stories that put the audience in real-life situations with not a monster or a demon, but an actual murderer or villain that could exist in the real world. Real depictions of cults and the way they can make people commit unspeakable acts. Real animals put in strange situations that they want to hunt humans down, that make us so terrified we want to wipe them off the face of the earth. And even stories about disturbed individuals that could commit real heinous acts in real life if the conditions were right. While many tricks and tactics can be used to set the tone for villains, there's usually one simple method that makes people's hair stand on end. Or fur in my case. And that's when an animal's involved. Want to show a kid will grow up demented? Say he killed birds when he was younger. Want to show that the villain is heartless? Off the dog in the next room. Want to make the cult seem really serious? Have them torture a cat. Animals dying in horror films, especially the ones where audience get to know them, can really flip a switch in people's heads. I mean, look at A Quiet Place Day 1, where people were more anxious about a cat dying than any of the people in the film. Heck, there's even a website called Does the Dog Die that literally goes through trigger warnings in film, and one of the top ones is if an animal dies in it. Though admittedly it is a really good website, especially if you have really bad triggers and phobias that make you anxious about watching films. I'm telling you this right now as someone who uses it quite a bit. The films actually are a little bit easier to handle if I know what's happening and their details about it. So please take a look if you have really bad mental health issues and are worried about something you're going to watch. Regardless, animal cruelty in films can be a huge way to up the stakes and make audience care about the story and people in the film, because most people love animals and we hate thinking about these innocent furry creatures being hurt. And also because we don't want to get reminded about what happens so often in our everyday society. Animal cruelty happens every single year because of selfish and disgusting people who wish nothing but harm on our furry friends. Factory farming, the fur trade industry, and animal experimentation are all disturbing enough. But there's also cases like animal abandonment, dogfighting, and other just general neglect cases that can make a person's blood boil. In fact, a new kind of animal abuse that has been creeping up is fake animal rescue videos, because people want the media attention and praise that comes from real animal rescue videos without doing the actual work to save an actual animal in distress. These guys will put those animals in repeatedly horrifying situations just for likes and subscribes. But that's a story for another day. Whether it's domesticated or wild, animals can suffer greatly at the hands of man, even by those who are supposed to love and care for them. But what happens when our furry friends are the star of a horror tale? When they're the victims of a serial killer? When their cozy home is threatened by the very people they're meant to trust and must race against time before they become his most loyal friend and servant? Well, you get a comic series that has left me more divided than I have in a long, long time. So let's start off the spooky season right by going over the one and only Straydogs. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Wolf Tales, where storytelling runs wild. Happy spooky season! Did you know this is one of my favorite times of the year? No joke. I watch a horror movie or episode every single day, and I love to watch Treehouse of Horror with my partners for the whole month of October. Not only that, I often listen and tell ghost stories, make homemade desserts and treats, and my den has at least one jack-o'-lantern for every beast in the forest. Don't worry, I grow my own pumpkins way in the back of my territory. I tried to sneak some from the local farm, but I got a cane in my head and a concussion for a week. While I am a lover of all things spooky season, I will admit I have to pick some more camp horror depending on the time of day of what I'm watching or listening to. Look, I may be brave, but I'm not a masochist. I'm not going to be listening to, I'm a 911 operator, I just listened to the most terrifying call, or watch Human Centipede at night. I want to be scared, not freak the out. The point is, if you hadn't guessed from some of the videos I've put on this channel, I love dark stories. Not exploitative schlock like Megan is Missing. If a story can come up with a good idea and handle the disturbing topics well with minimal exploitative nature, it has my respect. So I was looking through some new horror stories to consume this spooky season, like Rosemary's Baby, Silent Hill, Psycho, when I saw there was a comic dub made of a 3-year-old comic that featured Disney dogs meet 7. I was intrigued and decided to give it a go. Not only because I'm an animal lover, especially a dog lover, but also because the comic creators were Tony Fleecs and Trish Forstner. Fun fact, these two used to be in MVPcomics, and besides the fact I came from that fandom, I thought it'd be great to give this indie comic some support. So I binge read the 5-comic miniseries, sat back, and just thought, what the hell did I just read? Not because of the horror, but because of just how the comic was told as a whole. Because on the one hand, the highs were super high, but the lows were oh so treacherously low. Like Mariana's Trench low. And I knew these guys had worked in other comics before, at least as illustrators in the MVPcomics, as I said, and I love their pages as well as covers to bits and pieces. So I figured maybe I just wasn't getting it and it was my fault, and decided to read the 5 comics as well as the 2 additional side anthologies and the free comic book day prologue over and over and over and over for 7 times. And all I could feel after every single one was the art looks nice, but I feel hollow reading that story, because to me, it was a really interesting idea, but it was so poorly executed in the final product. However, when I went to see if other people felt this way, apparently a lot of people were claiming it was a masterpiece, impressive and incredible. And all I could see was looking at a comic whose story didn't add it up but looked nice and flashy. So I figured there was only one thing I had to do. I had to make this script and post up this video to see if anyone else felt the same way. Because I'm not sure if I was reading the same thing as them or if I somehow just misread it and need glasses. So without further ado, let's go over what happens when a serial killer messes with man's best friend. This is Straydogs. Our story takes place, as I mentioned previously, over 1 free comic book day prologue, 5 main comics, and 2 small anthology origin comics focusing on a dog named Sophie. Sophie, as I said, is our heroine, a yellow Papillon, who is taken in by a man known as the Master and his pack of dogs. A German Shepherd dog named Rusty seems to recognize her, but shakes it off and decides to give her a chance to take a look at the other dogs. There's Victor, the 3-legged Dalmatian, Gucci, the Chinese Crested, Henry, the Standard Poodle, other Henry, the Bull Terrier, Aldo, the Beagle Mix, Roxanne, the Malamute, Killer, the Pug, Imogen, the Tibetan Mastiff, and Earl, the Bloodhound. After she gets a tour of the house, the anxiety-ridden Sophie is wrapped in a red scarf by the Master, which triggers her memories of her new owner killing her previous owner. Realizing that her short-term memory will prevent her from remembering that she had a previous owner, eventually leading her to be loving to him as everyone else, When she digs up some details to reveal that all the other dogs were probably taken from their owners by the master, the horror of their situation starts to shine through. Together, they must leave their once Garden of Eden home and face the nightmares together before the master decides to turn on them. Now, I'm going to be quite honest. I can't talk about this thing without getting into spoilers. I'm really sorry. The comic is only 5 comics long, and unfortunately, to analyze it and to get to the real problem of this, I have to go in deeper. In fact, that short summary I described to you describes 2.5 of the 5 comics. I'm dead serious. For those of you who wish to go in blind, please go read the comics online. I implore you. Get your own opinion on it before you hear mine and come back when you're ready. For those of you having trouble finding copies of the comic, I'll link below a dub that CalebVA and a slideshow that MVPcomics did for the series, but it only covers the first 5 comics. Dog Days as well as the free comic book day version, I'm afraid you're going to have to look online for yourself, but they are there as I managed to find them. Take your time though, spoiler warning, 2 dogs die in the comic, 1 is horribly hurt, and you're gonna see people getting murdered in Dog Days as well as Stray comics, and a few dog remains in chapters 4 and 5. I'm just giving a warning to all of you because if you're not ready for it, it's really gonna hit you hard. And to put it simply, it's gonna really make you queasy. For those of you who have read the comic series, don't care if I give spoilers away, or are ready, all I can say is, by the ancestors, this comic is strange, isn't it? Don't get me wrong, a comic about dogs being the target of a serial killer is definitely weird, but that isn't why I'm confused. I mean, I'm someone that enjoys Saw, Trick or Treat, Alien, Predator, Alien vs. Predator, Scream, Get Out, Nope, Tim Burton's Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Jaws, Nightmare on Elm Street, 28 Days Later, Halloween, Chainsaw Massacre, Gremlins, Gremlins 2, Cabin in the Woods, Krampus, The Thing, The Blair Witch, The Vavitch, The Silence of the Lambs, and many, many other weird works. But this is one of the few horror tales I just feel so unsatisfied with. It just felt like I was eating toast. Not slathered with anything, just toast. It looks good, but it's not going to fill you up or make you feel satisfied. The comic was brilliantly drawn, and I will admit the dogs look terrific, but the story just didn't grip me and I felt bored by the end. Now, I will admit, and I have to say this, I totally agree with people that the idea is top-notch, that the drawing style is fantastic and all the appearance of the dogs are excellent, and that if you elevator pitched me this comic idea, I probably would say yes without a second thought. But the second you go in deeper, I would say to rewrite the thing. But again, I seem to be the minority here because everyone loves this comic from the reviews I can see, or at least like the art and don't really seem to care about the story. So I'm still really confused if it's me or something else. But if we're going to figure out what might be wrong with it or why I don't like it, let's get our noses to the ground and start sniffing out the most essential part of any tale, the story. As I mentioned, the idea is that these dogs are in a house of their supposed kidnapper. They all came from previous homes where they were single dogs or relatively single pet houses, living with mostly single women, though a few of them were not single women, and they were murdered by a guy who they all witnessed at some point, who then either bribed the dogs were too small to do anything, or the guy restrained the dogs so he could kill the people very close to where the dogs were. The comic then tries to heavily bank on the idea that the dogs have a very short memory and they won't remember most things after a few days. There is a whole opening monologue that goes over that with Sophie's original owner and a vet who goes on and on to explain that Sophie will remember her owner, commands, and her home to an extent, but not remember the office, vet visit, or the needle going into the dog, which is why the stakes are high. If Sophie and the others don't get out soon, they're going to basically forget their previous owners and live in a pretty alright place, except for the fact that punishment is in the back shed. Punishment's never explained, just that I think it's physical violence when it happens to Rusty. Except for the last part, it's honestly not a bad life considering the toys, food, and general attention they get, even if the guy is just wearing a mask for what he's really like. That sounds like a great elevator pitch, right? A nice story that I should think is terrific and great. So why am I getting so upset about it? Well, that's because, if I'm being honest, they got their math and science a bit wrong on short-term memory. See, whereas chimps only have 20-second short-term memories, dogs have 2 minutes. Now, that may make it seem like the comic's correct and they shouldn't remember anything past the 2-minute intervals, but that isn't really what it means, nor how short-term memory works. Short-term memory works that it takes anything you are given and process the information in a 2-minute period. Your brain then, in that processing time, will deem what is important and what is repetitive from the unimportant and the not wanting to remember it. In cases of short-term memory problems, it is a situation where people might not be able to process the information as well to their long-term memory, and it might take them a while to get things set. Now, I'm not a neurosurgeon or a doctor, I might be totally wrong, but from what I've gathered, this is what I've generally come to understand. It's why, for people who do not have memory issues, important things or things that are repeated on and on again will be switched to your long-term memory and stay with you in your memories. Just as how if you have interest in something, or even if you have no interest in it but it is repeatedly done to you or basically gotten into your brain, you will remember it. That's how, for example, I can remember 10 times 10 is 100 and pi is 3.14, even though I have absolutely no interest in math. It was repeated to me and thus I remember it. This is also why I remember D&D characters, Pokemon facts, animal or mythical creature facts, because it is important to me and I enjoy them. It is also the same reason that I forget about D&D monsters I don't like or have no interest in, Pokemon I find boring, or facts about animal that I don't like that I deem unimportant. But if I find those D&D monsters with a bad experience, Pokemon I hate because of what happened to get them, or even animals I'm terrified of, I'm gonna remember those facts. It's why it's so important when you're learning a new skill or trade to, as they say, practice, practice, practice. Because if it gets in your brain and it seems important enough to keep coming up, it's going to be remembered. And if it doesn't, it's going to be forgotten. So what does it mean for your dog then? Well, to make it simple, it's basically the idea that they're going to forget what they don't want to remember in that 2-minute period, and they're basically going to remember everything else so long as their brain determines it's important. If we use the comic, basically, Sophie will remember that the vet is a terrible place because there's pain, and she'll remember that home is safe. But she will not always understand that when you get in the car, you go to the vet, unless every time you go in the car equals the vet. The vet is also right that Sophie would remember commands and her owner and everything else if there is positive association with that person. And in a way, negative association will also be remembered to avoid and bring up fear and panic. It's kind of like how dogs will remember that floor on the trash gets them in trouble, but will also remember there is good things in the trash that they like, but will not remember the in-between, because the in-between isn't important to them, just what they like and what will get them in trouble. This is why positive training lasts far longer than negative ones, and why dogs who haven't seen their owners in a few weeks or even years will still remember them because they love their owners. As for previous owners, the basic idea when you get a new dog is to shower it in gifts and make it happy, because associating you with better feelings than when they were at their previous home helps transition better. They may not necessarily remember their old owners too well, especially if they have bad memories there, or good memories, but they will remember their old owners if there are good things or really bad things associated with it. For example, they may remember tennis balls if their old owner used it, or they may be afraid of newspaper if their old owner hit them a lot. This is a long drawn out way of explaining that with a little digging and a little fact checking, this entire thing about the dog's memory just falls to pieces like a knitted sweater. I know many of you might be angrily typing that I just need to let it go, that it's a story, that this is fantasy based and anything can happen, but this isn't fantasy. This is a comic about a serial killer who's an average Joe. There is no strange powers, mythical aid, demonic beings helping him. He's just an average guy. And considering they keep backing their entire story on this, I kind of have to treat it just as they do. In simple terms, if the dogs weren't puppies when they were taken, which in Dogs' Days shows that most of them were adults, they would remember their owners. And if they remember their owners, they would remember who killed their owners. So I should expect to see snarling, barking, growling, whimpering whenever they're near the guy, except maybe Earl and Imogen, who in Dogs' Days and issue 5 was shown to be puppies, who Earl was given plethora of treats, so of course he's loyal to the master. If this was going to be believable, if this whole 2-minute thing would be believable, the dogs should have come from bad homes. Homes where they weren't fed, hoarding situations, where they were left outside, given shock collars, made to be vegan. Any and all of this I could see as believable why they'd want to forget their homes. If they came from bad and abusive homes, that the master made the home far more enjoyable, then yeah, it makes sense why this would be a whole 2 minutes they forget thing. However, all the homes that they came from went above and beyond to give them good care. Heck, Henry is a prize-winning show dog. Do you have any idea how much good care those dogs and cats who are show-worthy have to be in to perform properly? A lot. Better than some people give their own kids. Considering the master hits them, locks them in a shed, and does other punishments, I highly doubt they would not remember their owners, and again would be fearful of the guy. And because this entire story and conflict runs on this whole 2-minute thing, the story just feels tiring. I still hate seeing the dogs in danger, don't get me wrong, it tugs on my heartstrings. I just don't feel scared for the dogs, that they're not in actual real danger, that the absurdity just makes the stakes low, not high. Even in comic 4 and 5, when it's revealed that the man killed all the 8 previous dogs he had before getting his new pack, making Victor the 9th dog he killed, we are never told why they died. It could be for all we can bank on old age or sickness, and he put them out of their misery. We are told that Victor died and see Victor died because he called 911 and a killer doesn't want authorities coming to his house, but we aren't told what happened to the rest. We also aren't told why Earl can't remember them even though he grew up with them. Basically, even if the killer killed all the dogs, wouldn't their scent be on him? Wouldn't their scent still be in the room like Earl found, and couldn't he have found that earlier? Again, looking at the heads in comic 4, none of the dogs are showing aging or gray fur. They're all perfectly fine. Even if Earl is described as old, he looks perfectly fine and can move just fine, so he's looking at maybe 7, 9 at the absolute most. So unless they're trying to get me to believe that somehow under the master's ownership, he has owned 20 dogs in the span of, 6 years, maybe 7 years? Maybe a little bit more, like 10 years if we think about before Earl got there. And that in that span of 10 years, he's owned, again, 20 dogs? And somehow Earl and Imogen have no memory? I have to call this out, because this makes absolutely no sense and the story is like Swiss cheese. Though, the more I'm thinking about it, it seems to me that the literary storytelling needs a huge overhaul, but the visual is terrific, making me believe that there's a very good chance that this is a pair of visual storytellers, not literary. Literary storytellers usually focus on the words on the page and how the flow of the story and its plots will affect the overarching tale. They can describe and showcase stories very well, demonstrating astounding character growth through their actions and knowing how to convey metaphors and plan events to make an engaging story you want to read. Visual storytellers, however, do the same thing but with images. They can make a costume design or even the color of the lighting tell a greater meaning and have the background be a character in its own right. They demonstrate their skills in creating visual references, impactful scenes, elegant artistic choices, and unique design to get the point across. Some storytellers, like me, have issues with one or the other. Mine is I have issue with visual rather than literary, and some can master both. For me, my literary skills are terrific, as I said, and I know I can tell a top-notch story if asked. But if you ask me to draw, I will not be able to give you as good a tale. While I don't think my drawing skills are horrible, I am self-aware enough to know that my skills need a lot of work and would not be appealing to others for a commission or story to do, and that I do a lot better job at describing scenes and telling a tale through novel, oral tales, and poetry. However, the team behind Straydogs has the opposite issue, essentially that they put a lot of work into it, but it really shines in the visuals. And that makes sense because before Straydogs, they were great illustrators and comic cover artists, but never had I seen anything with their writing skills, though maybe I wasn't looking hard enough. Throughout Straydogs, you can tell it's an amazing visual experience that it's appealing to look at, allowing each image to stand out and the comic to shine, which is very important for comics and graphic novels. However, they still need incredible stories to string them together, and that has to be taken into consideration when examining this. While I know I might get flack for it, it's the same thing I saw with Hazbin Hotel. Everyone was praising the animation, the music, the style of the show, but whenever you bring up asking about the story or characters, it pretty much became lackluster considering what was promised to us. However, just like Hazbin Hotel, it is a pretty delightful thing to look at when you want to watch, or in this case read, something really fun. Very clearly, the visual storytelling in the work is superb. The color red is not only used to describe the horror they see, but also to reveal the truth of the situations. When a dog remembers the horrors of their owners dying, a red hue is all over their memories, bathing the scene in not only blood, but also trauma. I'll admit, just as a fun little fact, that as an animal lover, I would have loved to see a blue hue, considering that's the color dogs see the best, but red is still powerful. Much of the environments at the serial killer's home are dulled and saturated to make it seem like it's less than loving and caring of a home for the dogs, except for the sunroom designed to put a fake livelihood in the environment. Comparing it to Dog Days, when we get to see the dogs' old homes are vibrant and show the love and care the families have for their pets, which is good foreshadowing for what's to come when they saturate more and more when the killer comes to their homes. Plus, the choice to keep the human faces out of frame so we just see the dog's perspective is fantastic, and reminds us who the POV is. As well, the victims get more screen time versus the killer, who basically only gets a real good shot maybe once or twice in Dog Days, and once seeing all of his face at the end of comic 5. It is a wonderfully made decision and helps us keep the focus. As a final little praise I'll give a nod to, making the dogs have a Disney-like feel was brilliant, specifically on 2 different fronts. One was to make it so that the dogs are cutesy and loving and we don't want anything to happen to them, which is perfect for a horror story. However, it also was playing on a little tongue-in-cheek, if we will, with the fact that in Disney movies, the mothers die relatively soon in the story. Since many owners are pet parents, making the women who die the pet moms, it does kind of give a little nod that the mothers are dying at the beginning of the tale. These are terrific and well thought out choices that very clearly tell a story that looks well and hits on the heartstrings, just not one that has a satisfying and consistent plot. Again, the memory issues really are what bring down a lot of this problem, and it's not even clear the rules on how it worked. It really is just a little too far-fetched for me, pun intended. As seen a few times in different comics, some of them remember a ball the last week and a trade that happened with it, but not a traumatizing memory that it could have happened 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, or possibly a year ago. They can remember habits like where they sleep, where they eat, but they don't seem to remember 1 minute what happened the day before, but then remember it the next day on a blink of an eye. In fact, Sophie is a great example of this. In comic 1, we see that she remembers a lot of stuff the first day she's there, but then when she wakes up, she can't remember squat. But in the beginning of comic 4, she can remember Victor died, she can remember the guy is a serial killer, and she can remember what Earl did to get Victor in trouble. And hey, that's not the only thing. There's way more. They don't seem to remember what a human skeleton is in one comic, or what graves are, and that they're under the porch because Killer had to dig into a grave to get the skeleton, but all of a sudden Sophie comes along and they can smell graves, know what a skeleton is, know that there are graves under the porch when they see them, and immediately knows that in the graves there should be dead bodies and dead dogs. They don't seem to remember anything about their homes or any of the other dogs that could have been there, but some reason they remember that Earl is the oldest pet. Speaking of Earl, for some reason he's claimed to have the best nose in the entire house and that he can smell anything from miles away. Yet in all the years he's been here, he somehow has never smelled the dead dogs coming from his master's room. There is perfect timing, and then there is this. And by the fang, it's annoying. Again, in comic 3 and 4, we know a night has passed, and probably in that time, Victor was killed, skinned, head mounted on the wall, all in one night, and somehow the master comes in with no smell, no blood, no nothing, and all of them seem confused at the fact that Victor was buried outside. Heck, in the case of the shed, that guy has a full setup work zone and somewhat even has blood probably in there from the previous dogs, yet Rusty was in there and saw nothing. Didn't see squat. Didn't really pick it unless there was a giant flab of Dalmatian fur coat in there for him to pick it up. On the top of that not making sense, the whole Victor getting in trouble also is convoluted, because somehow the master up in the room cannot hear all the barking from his 11 plus dogs almost, yet it takes Earl scratching at his door for him to hear them. It's not a big house, mind you. He could hear the dogs from the outside when they wanted dinner, yet not now? Heck, even in Dog Days, a similar thing happens where a collie named Lainey seems to remember her past, yet for some reason, it doesn't work. Nobody understands what she's talking about or wants to listen to her. And for some reason, we don't know why it didn't work. Why she didn't fight hard enough. Why she didn't do something else. I could bring up more and more points, but I think I need to take a pause for a second. While the concept of the dogs being taken by their owner's killer is really interesting, I can't emphasize that enough. These plot holes make the story less believable and more confusing. It makes it feel like any of them could have figured this out at any moment, and just so happens Sophie was there for, I don't know, purpose of the story? Coinky dink? I don't know. It just makes me think that they let the situation get as bad as it is, and it was pointless. It was pointless for Sophie to be here and to tell the story. That this whole scary situation didn't even need to exist. But going on a bit of a track, because I can already feel myself burning with anger, you want to know something we never figure out? Something that's never explained that you should normally do in a horror film? You know the villain? The master? The one we have the focus on? The one we're supposed to be scared of? We never understand why he's a villain or why he targets women. The dogs being taken are clearly his trophies. He has a collecting habit that's very common in serial killers. Sometimes he takes the bodies that has fabric on them that is a bit of a prize, and somehow he can get the bodies buried in the house without the dogs looking at the van or under the porch, even though they should at that time be able to smell their owners. And somehow the pictures are added into it, but the idea is that the pooches are his pretty pilfered prizes. They become a means to an end for the audience to get sympathy for the dogs, and we get to see that the master has taken, count it with me now, 19 dogs, including Sophie. And in that whole time, we don't understand why he does what he does and why he targets women. Part of the reason horror is interesting is when you can understand your villain's motives and why they do what they do. Bruce from Jaws is trying to survive. The real enemy is man. Great, awesome story. In Child's Play, we understand Chucky is first trying to get revenge on those who killed them and then make Andy's life a living nightmare. Great, sadistic serial killer. Love it. In Scream and I Don't Know What You Did Last Summer, it was about wanting to get personal revenge plus peer pressure in the case of Scream. Great, fun movies. We don't know a single thing about this guy's motivation except that he likes to kill women with dogs, and somehow his mold keeps breaking with either how many people are in the family, whether they have kids or are married, even though they're all supposed to be single women, and the season, because while some of them are in summer, there is, I believe, 2 that's in fall and 1 that's in winter. The only other thing we know about him that's concrete is he's a white guy with brown hair who likes to rescue dogs, who has sociopathic tendencies like rehearsing before he goes to find his victims, and changes dogs every now and then so he's not suspicious. That's it. Everything else, from how he started, his family history, his motives, and why he kills the dogs after keeping them for some time, is unknown. While I admit it's an interesting pile of unknown, I prefer my villains with clear motives and patterns. It makes it so much more fun to see how their brains work and pick them apart. Heck, I would have loved if we basically see that the guy brings the dogs back to the people who are asking for money and make up a random story about why the dog is in his care so he could get the money to pay for upkeep for the dogs. Or, I don't know, he takes the dogs to dog fights, and then when they fail, shoots them and stuffs them. Any of this would have been better. I mean, considering this looks like we're in Canada and America from the buildings and how the people are, can someone explain to me how this guy avoided 11 dogs, 19 if we take the past, with rabies vaccination and licenses fees? Because let me tell you, that is hard to do. Considering I am seeing at least an Android phone in dog days, this has to be from 2015 at least to 2019. Regulations on dogs, by the way, in Canada and America are huge, with collars with identifications, vaccination updates, and off-leash rules. It is very hard in a big city area, even in a country area, to go unregulated. Heck, I myself got a ticket for my dead dog Aloo because they were checking in and noticed she hadn't gotten checked in that year for her license renewal. Even at a dog park, if a person lets their dog off leash, they still need to wear a collar of some kind, or at least look generally okay, so people aren't going to call animal control. Plus, with that many dogs, and somehow none of them seem vaccinated, or possibly he never took them to the vaccination areas, because that would mean that they would see that they are lost dogs. These guys probably have a lot of diseases, especially in coming contact with other dogs, and dirt and everything else where these guys live. Which would then mean that the other owners would call the police or city hall to check this guy out. Heck, even if we ignore all of this, this guy has murdered 19 women and their dogs' posters are all over for the world to see. Yet he takes them to similar places they have gone before. I mean, really sit and think that in the background, we have seen all of these posters. He has clearly gone to these places because he knows them, and he keeps going back with the dogs who have gone missing. And somehow this guy flies under the radar of police, animal control, and veterinarian offices for years with 19 murders and 19 dogs. 19 murders for a period of, let's say, 7 years, and nobody says frick. By the claw, how is this even possible? Maybe in the 1980s, but with today's day and age with technology, He has a fang-sake show poodle who somehow is able to keep up his show-ready appearance and have a job that manages to feed a Tibetan Mastiff, a giant Tibetan Mastiff, and lives on a country property with a chain-link fence where everyone could see he's got 11 dogs, which is way beyond the legislation limits, and nobody questions him even a little. We never see the vets come over to look at the dogs and find chips and notice they're missing. We never see office officials monitoring him and checking his blood because, fun fact, his blood was left at a crime scene, and none of the police do research because he looks exactly like the suspects that any of the victims or people would see, especially the one that got away, because, fun fact, he was wearing a mask the entire time. And nobody has said squat. This is either the dumbest villain I've seen in the horror film in a while, or the dumbest writing of a serial killer I have seen in ages. And I just, by the ancestors, my head hurts. Does it make any sense why I'm confused? This comic offers such a fantastic idea, but then botches it so badly that you get infuriated, at least for overthinkers like me. Besides the story, well, the visuals, as I mentioned before, are really great. Each dog looks unique and they're distinct. That's the only uniqueness they offer. Basically, they stand out visually, but personality-wise, most of them are underbaked. None of the characters except for 4 have any real development and structure. Specifically, those 4 are Sophie and Rusty, who get the most, followed by Earl and Roxanne, while everyone falls to the wayside like roadkill. The background bodies basically can be summarized in 7 words or less for each of them. Victor has 3 legs. Imogen sleeps. Henry is a poodle. Other Henry is dumb and cowardly. Killer is hungry and has the worst memory. Aldo is Aldo, and Gucci used to be an influencer, though only seen in dog days. Otherwise, Gucci is the smallest. As for our 4 mains, when looking at them, Sophie is an anxiety-ridden pup who seems to spearhead the initiative. Rusty is a shepherd who takes charge of the other dogs, though seemingly is a little aloof. Roxanne is Rusty's girlfriend and kind of thinks of others. That's really it. And Earl is a loyal dog of the master who just likes treats and being a cynic. When the dogs do start to remember things, they get a little bit more development. Like Victor used to know how to call for emergency help, and Roxanne can smell and dig very well. However, if you were to ask me what makes each character great, I think maybe I could tell you about 5 of them. Everyone else, you're on your own. Heck, even in the sequel, prequel, comic Dog Days, we learn a little bit more about them from the fact of where their homes were before the master, but nothing really more besides the fact they all lived in really, really good homes. And possibly Imogen does remember the master killing her owner because of the depression she gets afterwards. Heck, we don't even see Rusty or Aldo's home, and for Killer, we see his home but not what happens when he was taken. Again, if there were maybe only 5 dogs in this entire comic, I could see it being more focused and the cast could be fleshed out well. But with 5 real comics and 2 anthology books trying to cram in over 10 characters, everything in the story is going to get squished to all hiffle and needs a ton of support. However, there is one thing I'd like to circle back on, which would fix a big issue in the comic that actually is implemented in the sequel comic Feral, that I think if it was done here would have improved the story tremendously. And that is remembering their genre and where the horror needs to be targeted at. The animals. Serial killers are scary to us because we know what they are. Our dogs being taken away and forgetting us is scary because we know what is going on. However, why would a dog be afraid of a serial killer who they don't get what that is and living in his home that's relatively perfect? The answer is they wouldn't. They wouldn't feel fear or anxiety about being in his home and getting to play and have fun. They'd be happy. They don't understand that a knife means a serial killer. To them, it's just a shiny object. They wouldn't understand a body in a grave unless they've understood that the body means death and that means that that's their owners. And if we have to put it this way, looking at something like Plague Dogs, the dogs understood that dead animals meant bad things, and that's why they got scared of the facility. That facility was terrifying to them, but then they understood that there were other things out there like knives and white coats and believed that that's what happened whenever they saw a knife. But these are just common dogs who wouldn't understand there's anything to be afraid with a man with a knife. Heck, if we're to bring that fear into a factor, and you wanted to make them have the fear of the Fang into them, why not make it something that the dogs would actually be afraid of? Not if they were traumatized and afraid, but something dogs would naturally be afraid of. Dog catchers, dog fight owners, maybe even to reflect the beginning, a vet. Examining Feral the comic, which I do want to do a deep dive one day, the main horror variant in there is the rabies virus. Rabies is an absolutely terrifying disease for us and animals. This unbelievably terrible disease makes a perfect threat in that comic, making the stakes feel high and believable, and that it makes it feel like our heroes have to fight to survive rather than they could just lay in the sunning room. If we pull on the idea that this guy was a rescue or a vet, I could understand why these dogs would be afraid of him, because there is the threat of euthanasia or just shots. It would, at least to me, give a very good depth to our character and give the villain a lot of layers. But if I make all these claims that these would be better for the entire comic, I might as well put my money where my mouth is and come up with some ideas that hopefully convince you all of what I'm talking about. So let's sit down and try to recreate this a little by first and foremost recreating our villain. I don't know about you, but villains with no motives and no kind of layers to them are pretty boring. So instead of him just being a normal guy out in the country, let's say this guy is a volunteer at a shelter or is a actual vet at a shelter or even a vet's office. Through his line of work, he sees the cruelty that people do to pets and thinks that people don't deserve their dogs, or at least that they're too dumb to own their dogs and not use them in the proper way in his mind. Or maybe he's a vet tech who feels that he deserves more money, respect, and admiration for what he does and is always stuck with animals he doesn't care about. So, getting a client book from the place he works at, he starts to get information about who comes here and with what dog. Their name, their species, everything. He then decides to go out and ask out those women on dates, only to be rejected, and that's what sparks things off. He waits and plans it out carefully before enacting his murder and then stealing the dog away for his collection. He could be even registered as a foster with the local vet, and thus no one would ask if there were dogs coming into his home, and all he'd have to worry about is the officials who would come by. He could have a large van for being a volunteer or a vet, and again, no one would question it. No one would be suspicious. And as for getting rid of the bodies, oftentimes shelters or even certain vets' offices have cremation areas to help out with that, so that's even better. He could strangle his victims or maybe even drug them out so they don't fight back, and then use the van to deliver them to certain areas. Heck, mentioning before, it could be more than just the fact that they stood him up. Maybe he looks at these women and thinks that he's better than them and that they should be taken out because he feels that they're, I don't know, disgusting or dumb, just something. Obviously, he then takes the dog to his home, nobody questions about it, and waits until the posters eventually disappear. When things eventually die down and the posters start to disappear, he takes the biggest and the best of them to go be fight dogs, and maybe even the smallest, scrawniest ones become bait dogs and get some money from that. Any he likes the skeletons of, or maybe his own way of trophies is he keeps the skulls, or maybe even uses them for his own veterinary office or rescue area so people can have anatomy prep. I don't know if it's just me, but doesn't that story seem darker and fit with dogs? Isn't that scarier to think that the people we entrust our dogs with could actually hurt them the most? Heck, thinking about Sophie, wouldn't it be good for her to conquer her fear of vets by having him be a vet for her to kill in the end? Wouldn't it make sense of why there's a large cast and no one else would question anything? And heck, if we're going to give characterization to other characters, wouldn't it make sense if the dog pack wasn't just a pack, but a cult? A cult that sees the master as their savior, led by the devoted and steadfast Earl. Using this dog who appears in Free Comic Book Day prologue as our first victim, we can guess that he's in charge considering how he acts throughout the comics, and that he was the one that mainly got everyone moving before Earl did. If we consider that this Chihuahua that seems to keep Earl from listening to Lanny as the kind of worker with this other dog, we can assume that these two maybe did some gaslighting to keep everybody in line. If we go over that thought as they were the leaders of this supposed cult of a pack, Earl would then be chosen to take over, learn the truth, grow up, and basically decide to take Imogen as his muscle to keep everyone in line. She already antagonizes other Henry. It's not too hard to think that in the comic, she would be the one to keep everyone in line through means of growling and biting. Then, as time passes, Earl sees that Rusty comes along and has something that he doesn't, which is charisma. He can use this to persuade and charm other dogs, like the master does with people, to fall in line and to do a more positive way to keep them on track. And it works great. By making these three basically be other villains in the comic, it makes the story have more depth, more, well, layers. It could even be added in that Rusty and Imogen are afraid of the Master and thus give it enough bite to show why they would want to follow a psychotic killer. Having dogs being tricked into thinking that they were taken away from abusive homes, or mingling with dogs from abusive homes and being tricked that things that happened in their homes were similar to that. Having their memory be changed and altered through gaslighting, and having the Master be seen as a savior, to me, would be super clever. It would give the comic a really big oomph of attention and care to detail. On top of that, I like the idea that the dogs think that all of what the Master does is for them and that they are the lucky few that he takes in. I also love if we think about Earl and thinking of him as almost kind of the secondary antagonist to the comic. The idea being that he thinks the Master not only is good, but is unbeatable and stays in line where he is because that's what he was taught as a puppy. Think of it like elephants. When elephants are in a circus or a work camp, they're taught at a young age to believe that ropes are unbeatable, and thus, when they get older, they don't break them when they're out on work or around the ring. This conditioning that's then used makes it so they think even when they're giant creatures that they will never be able to break the rope. If we think about this with Earl, maybe Earl has seen the fact that the Master can kill other people. Maybe his own old abusive owner. If Earl's old owner was not a young lady, but a fox hunter who didn't like the fact that Earl was unfocused and beat him senseless, and Earl already assumed that he was the Master, and this other guy is more powerful than his Master, he would believe that this man is the Master of Masters. And to me, could do a really good thing for the writing to explain Earl's motivations of why he's loyal. It could maybe be a reason of why Earl believes that the Master is good because in his mind he saved him from an even worse person. And heck, maybe that's why he's trying to keep the dogs in line. His motivation would be less villainous and more he has been on the horrible end of things and believes this is far better for everyone, that he's doing it for their own good. Plus, if we want to think about it this way, with Earl understanding that the dogs are killed if they're bad dogs when they're taken away, it could show the reason for his persistence of not going against him and his loyalty to the Master. As for Imogen and Rusty, their reasonings for doing what they're doing is, well, it's ingrained. Let's say Imogen is one of the fight dogs because Tibetan Mastiffs are massive. Imogen is constantly being used for fights, and thus, she always sleeps because she's tired. Heck, it could maybe even be why she bites and is cruel to others because that's what she's ingrained to do by the Master. Heck, maybe she's silent because one of the dogs attacked her throat and has damaged it, or she just doesn't want to talk to people she knows she's going to have to kill. Rusty, on the other hand, could have been a puppy that was brainwashed by Earl and had been missing from his owners a long time ago, and, again, has never seen the Master do anything cruel. Earl could have trained him with Imogen giving bad punishments for bad dogs, if we will, and get Rusty to understand what it means to be a good dog in the Master's eyes. Rusty would believe that the Master's good because he was never taken from a murder scene. He was just picked up from the side of the road and stolen. I don't know if it's just me, but all these points could make the story a lot more interesting. Heck, I even have a way to make the whole 2-minute memory issue maybe work better, because if the Master is a vet tech or rescue vet or just a vet, what if he had an access to a plethora of drugs to make them have memory issues? Many drugs for anxiety and stress, things the dogs would obviously need after what happens to them, affects memories of a person, including short-term memory, and acts as a sedative. If he's constantly giving these dogs the drug to recover, it would make sense why they would have those kinds of memory blips and not remember everything too well. And if he was a vet, it would make sense he would ask for those medications because he could just order them. And if he was a foster, well, it kind of would make sense why he needed and no one would question him. He could even make it really, really subtle by, if he was a vet, taking care of their shots himself and recording it on file and buying them lifelong licenses because, again, who is going to question him? Even if he's a foster, he could label it under the organization's name, so again, who is going to question? As for how this could connect with the story, let me try to play it out for you. When Sophie comes into the home and the master tries to give her anxiety medication, we could go down two different routes. One, Sophie could have been a dog that he just impulse controlled, killed the owner and took because maybe something happened at work, or maybe he liked Sophie or really loved the owner Sophie had and hated being rejected, and so hadn't gotten the information that she's on an anxiety medication that's stronger than the one he gives the dogs. So when she takes it, it does nothing, and she still has her memory fine as it was. Or it could be that when he gives her the pill, she doesn't want to take it, but when he does force it down her throat and then massage it, she ends up getting sick and throws it up, thus keeping the effects out of her and her memory clear to remember exactly what he did to her old owner. Realizing that this place is bad, it would give a great reason as to why Sophie would then have a better memory compared to others, and even connect into Lanny, because going from my own collies seem to have a little bit of stubbornness with anxiety and basically can take a lot of medications before they go down. Basically, Rusty could start to see some of those disagreements coming up and try to convince her that she's insane, or gaslight her into thinking that what she's saying is nonsense, but she starts to show him the truths about Earl's lies and the Master's lies and show him that there's a better life out there. Heck, to rally the other dogs, maybe they start to not take their medicine, Earl and Imogen start to attack them to get them in line, and then Sophie reveals a truth about Earl that everyone believes, but ends up being a lie, that Earl is actually unable to smell. See, Earl looks a lot like Trusty from Lady and the Tramp, right? So, considering we already have a reference that he gets hit by a car at the end of the comic, what if it was the fact that Earl couldn't smell and thus made it seem like he could to keep everyone in line, so if they smelled blood, he would say he didn't smell it and he has the best nose. But as everyone starts to question Earl, they realize these are lies and try to get out because they realize they're in big trouble, especially when Sophie would bring evidence that the Master was going to kill them and taxidermy them. Heck, if we want to think about it, maybe that's how Earl finds the other taxidermies and does eventually believe it, instead of just miraculously having a sense of smell that works on that day. As for other points, I would have loved to see that maybe the smaller dogs are dosed with too much medication and that's why Killer is basically the worst of the bunch for memory, or maybe the fact that Victor has some neurological issues and that's why he's able to remember because, you know, he's got to have more medication, and Sophie basically convinces him to take one medication but not the other, and stuff happens that way. There are a ton of other things I could get into, like the fact that some of the dogs might have different medications they're on, and Sophie might accidentally, quote unquote, dump them into a place, causing the other dogs to eventually be weaned off the medication and remember, or the fact that Imogen talks if one of them is sent down to the fight pit and tells her to lay still and eventually hide, or maybe even the fact that Earl finds one of his old companions just like the heads, but even more gruesome of a display or the entire body. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who thinks this, but to me, getting back on track, I think all of these things could have made the story better, but what we got was a decently enjoyable art experience that was a stepping stone for a much better comic that these guys make. This story was way too long to tell in 5 comics, 2 anthologies, and a prologue. And, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think they know what they wanted it to be. It felt like, as they were doing their research, they read Beasts of Burden, were inspired to make their own horror animal comic, but failed at the execution about how to make the story creative and well thought out. They wanted to try to make something that could rival things like Scream or Nightmare on Elm Street in the horror business, but it came out as a Jaws 2 or modern day Prom Night. The shock value that comes from seeing Victor's corpse is honestly the biggest horror we ever see except the murders, and it just felt a bit too much. It felt like it was incredibly extreme, with nothing to prepare us beforehand or after, and the fact that this is the most exploitative part in the entire comic we ever get. So there is no build-up, and it's a little bit disturbing to see it right then and there. We're given no indication this happened to the other dogs, or if there is, we see no skulls or additional pelts except for the heads in the cabinet. Yet, in some twisted way, it makes sense for this to be here because, well, the master is a murderer, and murderers, especially sociopaths, generally kill and hurt animals. I mean, heck, that's what I made this entire video about. Of course this had to be there, but it's still just so weird. And like I said, it jumps all over the place. It starts off as a mystery, then horror spikes in, then mystery, then horror, then thriller, then ending with horror. It spun around so fast that I thought I was going to get whiplash from trying to keep up with everything. However, despite the fact that the execution failed, it did, however, make an interesting idea, and effort was clearly put into it, especially when we look at the art and the drawings. Heck, one of the things I found with everyone who read the comic is while many did like the comic, the biggest thing they loved was the covers, and I have to give it to them. Those are some amazing parody comics. They're creative, fun, intuitive, and I'm going to be honest, pay a huge tribute to horror as a whole, but it just doesn't come out in their writing. But for the plus sides, the art is wonderful, the ending is nice, and thankfully, the stories in Dog Days allow us to see what came before and does give us a bit more insight into the characters. At least a few of them. Heck, even the free comic book day prologue really does fit in the story better, and I dare say actually is a better opening than just the normal comic with Sophie starting us off. I hope all of the comics include that little prologue, because I'm not gonna lie, it just does not hit as hard without that opening. Overall, this was their first comic they were making, and despite how infuriating it was, I have seen worse comics. I have seen way worse comics than this, and as much as I got angry with the story, I still enjoyed myself. It's still a comic I'll keep in my mind, and maybe every now and then I'll take a look at it. And despite all their blunders they did in Straydogs, I have to admit, I think it was a great stepping stone to their far better comic, Feral, which, as I've mentioned, focuses simply on a zombie outbreak through the eyes of the rabies virus. The story is simple and unique. It knows what it wants to be and doesn't become too complicated. It slowly shows the horror and makes it constant so you don't feel it just comes out of nowhere. It makes even the animal horror genre better because, again, that virus is something both we and the animals would be afraid of. It's genius. It never has to prove to me that it's animal horror. I believe it, and the stakes are believable, and I actually get on the edge of my seat to want to see how it continues and how they can get out of those situations. It is everything Stray Dogs should have been, and if I'm being honest, it proves to me that if they redid Stray Dogs now or gave it another go, I think Stray Dogs could be an incredible comic that could rival Feral, if not do better than Feral. This is a long drawn out way of saying that if you want a really good visual experience that makes you see a good animal horror series, then please take a look at it. Despite everything I said about its story and anything else, it is a good comic series. Take a chance and get lost in the world of blood and drama with Stray Dogs. For now, if you all don't mind, I think I'm gonna go hug Bandit and tell her she's a good girl. That Tanuki hasn't been seen for a while, but you know what? I love her all the same. Remember to like and comment if you enjoyed the video, and hit the subscribe and bell if you want to keep up to date for future videos. Remember, after the poll that was done, it's been decided that Wolf Tales will be on Fridays and Trothar will be on Saturdays. So come back tomorrow to take a look at Trothar Chronicles taking flight at 2 p.m. on Saturday, and come back on Fridays to take a look for more Wolf Tales. For now, this has been Silver Starling. See you next time you want to run with the pack.